In 1961, gallerist Arturo Schwartz penned a letter to Daniel Sperry informing the artist of an incident concerning two of his tableau pièges, in English snare pictures. Whilst in storage at the Galleria Schwartz in Milan, it appeared that they had fallen victim to the antics of several rats. The rats had made a devastating meal of Sperry's artworks, and Schwartz, owner of the tableau pièges, insisted that the artist repair the damage by replacing the rat-eaten parts, already enclosed in a letter, a check for Sperry's travel expenses. Notably, not only did Sperry eventually refuse Schwartz's request, he also thought it more fitting to rename both artworks in a way that directly drew attention to the damage, adding as an addendum to the original titles, Avec le rat de la Galerie Schwartz. And I apologize for the pronunciation, but here on the screen they're titled slightly differently, and you can see one is before the collaboration and one is labeled as after. The tableau pièges stand out as amongst the most recognized artworks of Sperry's oeuvre. First realized in 1959, they tend to comprise the leftover remnants of chance-derived food-based situations: half-eaten loaves of bread, fish bones, dirty plates and cutlery, stained napkins, cigarette butts and the like, fastened by glue to their found surfaces. Notably, with chance as a constitutive element of the tableau pièges, Sperry suggests that such artworks exist in an extended state of creation, rather than limited to a fixed condition associated with a singular moment of making. The tableau pièges might continue to transform with chance events. For Sperry, then, the interference of the rats had to be accepted with chance. Writing in his anecdoted topography of chance, Sperry would note that, quote, working with chance situations implies the acceptance of chance as a collaborator after the initial result has been achieved, of transformations due to time, weather, corrosion, dirt, etc. Example, the rats who devoured the organic matter on two of my snare pictures at Galleria Schwartz in Milan have been accepted as collaborators, unquote. Sperry's embrace of chance is exemplative of what has been deemed a temporal turn of art and its theories in the late 1950s, where, with unprecedented impetus, art becomes associated with events, processes, performances, actions, and happening. From cheap plastics to food and even at times feces, the new materials of art were prone to change and transform in ways sometimes unforeseen and nevertheless embraced, at least by some artists, not limited to, but including different forms of decay. The temporal turn both confronted and complicated key assumptions that, up to this point, underpinned classical conservation practices. That is, the assumption that artworks are mostly fixed objects, singularly realized in a discrete medium, and a physical embodiment of the sole artist's intention. The work of conservation saw itself largely as attempting to keep an artwork the same, or as same as possible to the time of its initial creation. This is no longer an accurate picture of conservation. Today, conservation discourses advocate a multiplicity of theories, practices, and attitudes towards conserving artworks. Methods and modes of conserving might include practices of storytelling and the transmission of embodied knowledge as much as it is and has been a materials-based science. And forces of change and transformation, once largely understood as negative values, are not only accepted or managed, but sometimes understood as the condition of an artwork's survival. Even as conservation has and continues to evolve in reciprocal relation with artworks that challenge its existing frameworks and conventions, the case of Sperry's rat-eaten tableau pièges, and particularly his raising of the rats to the level of collaborators, would be considered as something of a taboo situation. In the context of conservation, animals like rodents, birds, and most prolifically insects preying on works of art are commonly constructed as pests, a concept which, at times describing animals like rodents, birds, insects, and for that matter also humans, is far from neutral. As suggested by recent literature on the use of chemicals in conservation during the 19th and 20th centuries as a means of pest control, the pest as a construct attempts to enforce somewhat artificial boundaries between, for instance, nature and culture, self and other, the pure and the impure. This turn to chemical control was not only fueled by practical necessity, but also by, in addition to colonial ideologies, the not unrelated construction of the modern human as a discrete entity, cut off from the forces and flows of the natural world. As is already established by conservation historians, the emergence of conservation as a profession is closely associated and entangled with the zeitgeist of a modern scientific objectivity. This consolidates with great technological impetus the enlightened ideal of science as a measure of controlling and domesticating natural forces. As an object of inquiry, something to be observed, scrutinized, and analyzed, nature is produced as other. If, for various motivations and at different times, a significant chunk of conservation's relatively short and mostly Western history has been to slow down nature's course, to cover up, mitigate, and prevent forms of deterioration, to what extent can conservation be understood as an expression of man's dominion over nature? And how might changing conceptions of the self implicate conservation? How does conservation participate in the construction of human subjectivity? Today, I want to open up rather than answer these questions definitively and begin to tie together what are quite disparate discourses currently. I want to suggest that the conservation of art and material culture more broadly can't be separated from conceptions of the human self, and more specifically the self in terms of the theoretical and physical boundaries of the human body. Implicating and implicated by conceptions of the self, I want to, in a somewhat experimental and speculative sense, situate the concept of art conservation in dialogue with the concept of the food chain as it exists in its simplest sense in the popular imaginary and in its critique by the late ecofeminist philosopher Val Plumwood. So food chains, in their most basic conception, might be described as visual representations of what eat what in an ecosystem. Generally, they depict linear lines of energy flows and transfer from organism to organism, foregrounding eating as a crucial event of energetic exchange that, through interspecies dependencies, helps sustain life on Earth. For Plumwood, according to predominantly Western metaphysics, the concept of the human is hyper-individualized, and humans are thus positioned, quote, outside and above the food chain, not as part of the feast in a chain of reciprocity. Animals can be our food, but we can never be their food. Human exceptionalism positions us as the eaters of others who are never themselves eaten, unquote. What Plumwood refers to as human foodiness, then, might be positioned as a neglected energy narrative hinged on a critique of human exceptionalism, insofar that our own edibility, the foodiness of our own flesh as a source of energy is, Plumwood observes, quote, monstrous, exceptionalized, and subject to extreme retaliation, unquote. Perhaps more so than in any other domain, Plumwood argues that it is in Western death, burial, and mortuary practices that best testify to this aversion to human foodiness, oft aimed at preventing the decaying body from nourishing and sustaining other forms of life. Plumwood notes that this is in opposition to indigenous, animist concepts of self, wherein death might be understood as a form of recycling and a, quote, flowing on into an ecological and ancestral community of origins, unquote. If death is nourishment, nurturing, and material continuity with the earth and its ecological others, it is a positionality that Shkrari does not seem to take issue with, as he once put, quote, I am happy to think that the worms will eat me. I like this continuity. Until now, I have eaten animals, so it is only right that they eat me. So I will live on in a certain way, unquote. And here is just a sketch of a food chain that I found that I thought best depicted the afterlife of the human as somewhat sustenance for other creatures. What then does our being edible have to do with the perception of arts being edible? To what extent does conservation perpetuate not only art's inedibility, but also human inedibility? That is, inedibility is a symptom of the bounded human body. Conservation of art and of the human self are arguably firstly and foremost linked by the powerfully discursive affects of metaphor. As art historian Angela Matasek has highlighted, conservation shares in the anthropomorphic metaphors of the medical profession. Artworks, for example, like humans, are described as living and dying, as injured and aging. one finds much medical terminology amongst conservation lexicon. Artworks are described as being cared for, or they might have diseases, be diagnosed, and receive remedies. Sociologist Fernando Dominguez Rubio alerts us to the fact that care for artworks sometimes surpasses the care for humans. In times of war, for example, the loss of artworks might be mourned more than human deaths. And along similar lines, the energy consumption of one of the storage facilities for a popular museum in New York is higher than that of a large hospital. Perhaps this overlap isn't entirely surprising, given the closely entwined histories of conservation and medicine. Yuko Okawa has shown, for example, that prior to the professionalization of medicine and conservation, and medicine's professionalization, like conservation, closely associated with its increased scientification, conservation and medicine shared in similar bodies of knowledge and also in personnel. As the fields became more distinct, they then shared in similar technologies, with conservation adopting technical innovations increasingly used in medical practice in the 19th century, such as X-rays and dentistry tools. Arguably the most potently symbolic visual symbol of the entwined histories of medicine and conservation is the white lab coat, worn by physicians starting in the late 19th century, and then following suit, conservators. Dress, it should be mentioned, is not incidental to either practice, but rather speaks strongly to an embodied identity in reciprocal exchange with broader cultural phenomenon. As historians of surgery have suggested, in the case of the white lab coat, this is not only an attempt to self-fashion the identity of true scientific professionals, but at the same time to perpetuate and reinforce a growing modern ideal of cleanliness, fueled by industrialization, chemical inventions, and of course attitudes to race and class. And just as it is possible to hold the clean body as an ideal, it is also possible to desire clean cultural objects. Time doesn't really permit me to go into the phenomenon of cleaning and conservation, but I just wanted to share these images of quotes, dirty objects, unquotes, that have to varying degrees and intensities been eaten by insects. You can actually see in both the carcasses and also in an eaten spaghetti box, the like a residue of the dead insects, and also frass, which is insect feces, and the skin that they have shed. To begin closing this paper, I want to tie together Sperry's rat-eaten tableau pièges and Plumwood's alerting our attention to human foodiness. Arguably, the foodiness of humans and of art come together in the painterly genre of the still life, and still life specifically in its 16th and 17th century Northern European instantiations in particular. Historically considered a lonely genre because of its lacking in human subject, and yet the still life's depictions arguably stand in for the human subject. Worth noting is that there is already an established link between Sperry's tableau pièges more broadly and the still life paintings. These two artworks, for example, were thematically grouped together in an exhibition on time in Zurich last year in a section on the biological perspective of time. In the exhibition catalogue, the curator suggests that it is our bodies that depict the most vivid and intimate measure of time's passage. But next to this, the passage of time is visually enshrined in motifs such as the hourglass, the skull, rotting fruits, and wilting flowers. These things, tending to dominate the iconography of still life paintings, are often thought to invoke vanitas, which in turn holds close associations with the transience of all things earthly, the inevitability of death, and the vanity of being mortal, and vanity also perhaps of attempting to conquer art through death. Art historian Harry Berger, however, offers another interpretation. More specifically than vanitas, it is often rapacitas that is on show, which in other words is the couching of nature as hungry and perpetually fueled forth by its voracious appetite. Berger suggests that the depiction of insects and other animals lurking, gnawing on, or emerging from organic matter shifts the viewer's attention from the impermanent, that which is nibbled on like partly eaten fruit and foliage, to the activity of the eater. Building on Berger, it is arguably the activity of the eater through which such still lives find their most contemporary resonance and relevance. Foregrounding rapacitas rather than vanitas is arguably to foreground the permanence that stems from transience, that life stems from, grows, and feeds on death. And this is perhaps Plumwood's insistence of ecological continuity of death at play here, which at its crux is a matter of advocating for the porosity of the human flesh as a site of reimagining relations between nature and culture. Prefigured by Plumwood's aforementioned indigenous animist conceptions of the self, certain spheres of contemporary theory have begun to rework the boundaries of the human body. The body now might be recognized, if not for its foodiness, then at least for its transcorporeality, Tvorosesi Alamo's term, outlining the inherent interconnectedness of humans and all creatures of the material world. Donna Haraway is also keen to remind us of how microbiology shows only 10% of our cells are distinctly human cells, while 90% are comprised of, amongst others, the genomes of protists, fungi, and bacteria. What has been perceived as the self, it seems, has all along been shot through with the other in a way that complicates ways of knowing and being that work to preserve the self as distinct from the other. Returning again to Shwari's rat-eaten tableau pièges, Robert Filio, artist, close friend, colleague, and collaborator of Shwari's, hints that this rat-eating fiasco might have itself offered the artworks an intriguing sense of continuity and oddly a kind of conservation in itself. Quote, the collaborating rats contributed to some extent to the utility value of the tableau pièges. At least these works of art were not simply gathering dust, the fate of so many paintings stacked in the storage annexes of museums and galleries. Unquote. Thank you.